Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to episode 53 of the Simpa Life Podcast. I am joined this evening by a guest who actually is probably one of the first people I spoke to on an open platform. Invited me out to visit him in the States and was the reason why I spent six weeks driving 6,000 miles across multiple US states to try and figure out exactly what was going on in the cannabis industry. So tonight's guest this is going to be quite a bio. Here you go, folks. An American peace, social justice, cannabis and drug policy reform, environmental politics, and racial justice activist. He is a musician who, along with Gary Cook, organized the first Hempfest in Seattle in Washington. That is the state of Washington and not Washington, D.C., for my non-American listeners. Back in 1991, which is now the world's largest yearly cannabis rally. It is huge. It is amazing. And we'll discuss further. He is the host of Hempresent on cannabisradio.com, which, as I alluded to earlier, was one of the first platforms that I spoke on. It was the first international platform I definitely spoke on. So I'll need to thank him personally for that shortly. He is currently the managing editor at Skunk Magazine. He is the author of Protestival, literally the progenitor of the term Protestival, a 20-year retrospective on Seattle Hempfest. Well worth a look, folks. We'll discuss that further shortly. He's got a mountain of other accolades that we'll discuss shortly, but we'll, for now, cut it short and just say, how are you doing, Vivian McPeak?
Great, Simpa. It's really an honor to be joining you today. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you've been quite high up on my guest list for quite a while now, because as I sort of alluded to there, for people that don't know, I randomly decided to do a 6,000-mile road trip across several legal US states in 2018 after a conversation with Vivian on his radio show. It was, quite amazing.
Great. I'm glad that I was able to inspire you to check out our crazy country.
Oh, and how crazy. I mean, this is, as we were just talking about before we started recording, how much has changed since that conversation, and how much has changed even sort of since 2018 when I was there last in terms of different regulations in different states. I think it's doubled now the number of adult consumption legal states. And I suppose one of the first questions I kind of wanted to ask you about, since we're on the topic now, is Washington still the only legal recreational or adult consumption state that doesn't allow home growing?
Yes. That is unfortunately the reality. There's a downside to being one of the first. Is you kind of get stuck. You get stuck with what you got that time, and the other states that have been reforming, either the legislators or the people crafting the citizen initiatives kind of learned what to do and what not to do by watching the first couple states.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite interesting. I think Washington and Colorado voted at the same election. So was it the 2010 and it took till 2012 to come into effect, or was it 2012 and it took... No,
well, I think it was 2012 election, if I remember correctly, and it took a little while to institute everything.
Yeah, because as you say, it's sort of kind of first mover advantage, but also first mover disadvantage in that the legislator, I imagine, in Washington is like, you've got your pot, leave us alone, you won.
Yeah, there's another thing that we have, which is very unfortunate, which is a 5 nanogram non-scientific THC blood level DUI, driving while impaired law, that we are stuck with here. And to be honest with you, I was against Initiative 502. I voted against, and this is crazy, as somebody had spent, at the time over 20 years as a campaigning to reform the cannabis laws. I voted against I-502 because I thought that it was inadequate, and that we would be, and I predicted that if we voted this in, we're going to be stuck with it, especially the DUI thing, because what politician wants to relax the DUI standards, and then one car accident, one death or something, and then his career is over, right? And so I argued against this bill. I also celebrated the day that it passed, because even though I didn't vote for it, because I did understand the significance of it, and that it was the icebreaker, that we were, was the first state to quote quasi legalize cannabis, recreational cannabis. But I knew that we could do better, and I felt that that some trade-offs had been made, some compromises had been made in the effort to just get it passed that I don't think were necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, as you said, I think we're up to 19 states now, although some of them are kind of in the position Washington and Colorado were for the first year, where they've passed the legislation, but they haven't got any framework for it yet, or they haven't implemented, rather, the framework. But they've had the opportunity to be snobbish, to be a bit, no, we don't want this. So the first attempts at New York's decriminalization rather than legalization sort of fell apart at the last minute, because they wanted to, again, just, we'll change this and change that, and then a little bit of this and we'll add that. And it didn't represent what the people who were backing it wanted from it. It became sort of mutated into something that was going to represent the interests of the same people who were already benefiting from the status quo of it being criminalized.
Yeah, well, it's all very controversial within the reform community, Simpa, because there's a lot of money to be made. I mean, the reality is, we're talking about $1 billion industry, and we all know what happens when there's big money involved, and the big players come in, and there's a tug of war. And I'm very frustrated, because what we've seen here in America is the same kind of corporate, moneyed, privileged interests who had no problem with prohibition are now racing in to profit off of the legal recreational cannabis market. And a lot of the folks, like my community of reform activists and medical marijuana patients, and people that laid the groundwork and sacrificed and took risk, and put in tremendous amount of shoe leather organizing, kind of got swept under the cannabis, and I have not really had the opportunity to be included on the level that we think should happen. And then even worse than that are the marginalized and targeted communities, like communities of color in America, who were disproportionately targeted and prosecuted and incarcerated under prohibition. They have not had the opportunity to enjoy the benefits, and profit off of the legalization market. And if anybody should be included, it should be the people who paid such a disproportionate and unjust price.
Yeah, entirely. And I think you're right. It is becoming, I think, even more contentious than it was when the first reform bills were put together, because there are so many different nuanced arguments about the consequences of legalization. We've now arrived at the point of the world isn't going to end. Literally next year, Colorado and Washington celebrate 10 years since that historic vote. Obviously, with 9 years, I guess, next month. And if you then look at what's happened economically, you look at the crime impact, you look at the statistics around things, generally as a whole, nothing got worse. A lot of things improved, a lot more tax revenue. You've now got places like Illinois and that are hitting the $1 billion mark. You're going to have it in most states, even some states that people are looking at and going, yeah, that is not a cannabis hotspot, are suddenly able to turn over these vast sums of revenue. And consequently, you're seeing reductions in alcohol consumption. You're seeing improvements in physical and mental health. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration as a potential negative to the powers that be. And so I think the reason we're seeing a slowing or such a resistance of the different bills that are coming up federally in America, or at least from my position over the pond, is that they would be too good. It would be too much benefit for different, like lower classes, different marginalized communities. It would give them that fair foot in the fight. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why Washington is probably still going to be in this unfortunate position for quite a long time to come.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a couple of good things that are happening, and that is that the last several states that have tipped to legalize recreational cannabis have proactively, and some of these were legislatures, not citizens' initiatives, they have proactively embedded social equity components into their laws. Now, I think that most of us could argue that they're inadequate, that they don't go far enough. But the fact that they're sensitive to the issue and that they're already trying to proactively address the issue, I think is a good sign. And what we really need is we need to make sure that there's job opportunities for communities of color and those that have been disproportionately targeted, and for those that have been incarcerated, regardless of their color, because of cannabis. They should have job opportunities in the recreational industry. But more importantly than that, there should be training and placement for managerial and ownership positions, not just barista making minimum wage. But we need to make sure that these people have an opportunity to really participate on the higher levels of business and commerce, because we're talking about a lot of money. And man, there was a lot of injustice. I mean, a lot of injustice, a lot of families destroyed, a lot of lives, taken away from crazy prisons. We still have 24 Americans or so serving life in prison for cannabis. And that's, a travesty of justice right there. That should be an oxymoron, cannabis lifer. So there's a lot of injustice to sort, really. And it's complicated, and there's zoning issues, and there's a lot of municipalities, even in the legal states, there's municipalities that have voted to ban cannabis sales from their city or town, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an ongoing battle. And of course, we're in the post-Trump America where things are politicized beyond anything in our past history. And everything's a part of the culture war now. And there's, a level of disinformation being waged that's just almost Orwellian, actually. And so that, kind of complicates everything else. But it is interesting that cannabis in America has kind of transcended partisan politics, which I never thought I would see in my lifetime, because it was always a little bit partisan, with the liberals, progressives, Democrats being more for legalization and the right-wing Republicans being against it. But it's no longer even mentioned in campaigns and stuff. So that, I think, is kind of a quantum shift, quantum sociological shift, where they've kind of thrown in the towel. They kind of realize that this is the eventuality. This is here to stay. And then again, I think the other element that I have to mention is that we're talking about money. And that's the language of the conservative right wing, right? Economics is their language. And those of us old sourdough activists always knew that, what we experienced was that you could talk all day about injustice. You could talk all day about the disproportionate sentencing or anything like that, and you got no traction. You started talking about tax revenues and jobs, and all of a sudden their ears would perk up and they wanted to talk, right? So we always knew that economics would be the thing that would push this over the cliff, and that seems to be what's happening right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, over here in the UK, it is weird. It flipped. So then our Conservative, which would be our version of Republicans, I guess, ruling party here in the UK, were the ones to change the law around medical access back in 2018. And they almost became like the party of compassion, because at the same time, we're basically the same as you guys, a two-party system effectively. So our opposition, the Labour Party, they came out in a stance of not wanting to decriminalize cannabis and wanting to be tougher on drugs with sentencing. And they went out with the traditional kind of bolstering vote, that's it, air quotes, vote winning mantra about drugs. And they just got ridiculed. And they missed a prime opportunity. So then all of a sudden, these guys who were painted as the fascists and the evil and the nasty party suddenly became they're allowing this to happen. But they're also then meeting their core goals through it. So the Conservative Party in the UK went, their dream is to get rid of socialised healthcare, destroy the NHS. They've been trying to do it since it was created by Clement Attlee after the Second World War. And this is the closest they've come, is that if they've created dozens of private clinics that are charging patients God knows how much amount of money. It's slowly coming down, but it's still quite an obscene amount of money through the various referrals and things that you need to gain access to it, while then not allowing the prescriptions on the NHS. So our health service is massively overburdened, struggling. They're paying through the end for even things like simple paracetamol and stuff like this. So then cheaper, same with you guys with prescription costs of medications, because the NHS then buys in contracts, they're beholden to the suppliers for whatever they're charging for that contract. So they're basically getting two birds, one stone. They get to control that end market while then also getting a foot in the recreational or adult consumers market, because then they own the vertically integrated infrastructure for supply. So it's then become still our opposition party are not on board with this. It's only our Green Party that have kind of gone, we want to legalize cannabis and decriminalize all drugs. They've got a much more progressive stance, but no real model for it. They say they'd view America and Canada, learn lessons and build an applicable model. But until they've got something to present, people are looking at the Conservatives and going, well, they've done this already for the medical users. They'll have our back if we want to then be able to smoke it in social clubs or in pubs or whatever.
Well, we have a very similar situation in America where our right-wing Republicans are extremely against public health care, socialized medicine, staunchly against it, right? And they want to privatize everything. Basically, they're against, public anything. Mm-hmm. But that's an interesting dichotomy that you're dealing with over there. I'm just curious, how much political influence or power has the Green Party in the UK at the moment?
No, they are growing, but the problem is our press is so badly repressed. I think the 85% of all British media is owned by 5 billionaires. So it's ridiculous. I think 4 of them are non-doms. I think one of them is a lord. So it's interesting the positions that they've got themselves in. So they don't speak of anything that is even contrary to neoliberalistic politics. So they're still keeping a good old left-right debate. So when somebody like Jeremy Corbyn rose through the Labour Party, he's been there in 40 odd years, he got the closest anybody has to have a centralist kind of government for the longest time. And then because of the rejection of that, it pushed a lot of Labour voters towards the Green Party. And I think the youth have really got a grip on it in terms of environmental impact, in terms of drug reform policy, things like decriminalization of sex work. They're really trying to think the long term for their actual futures. Whereas I think the Conservatives are still traditionally the older generation that are, they want their bum hip to be all right. They want to deal with themselves and have that I'm all right, Jack mentality, and not then consider the millions of people who may very well still be getting a therapeutic benefit from it, but either don't want to identify or don't recognize their own right as a patient, I guess. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Yeah, we have the same media consolidation here in America, where the majority of the media is owned by a small cabal of billionaires, and they're almost all right-wing, unfortunately. But there is underground media today, fortunately, and the kind of mixed bag of social media, which is kind of a cesspool, but also gives us the ability to have our own messaging and stuff like that. So these are complicated times. And one of my pet peeves, of course, since we do have an industry that is growing here in America, a recreational cannabis industry. And let me just preface that first by backing up and saying that what happened in our state and in several states is that the medical marijuana paradigm that already existed got dismantled and replaced by commercial interests and recreational cannabis, and the patients paid a dear price, and unfortunately it's the medical marijuana patients are like the last priority of the recreational industry, and so that's a trade-off that was actually very unfortunate. But moving forward, we have this advancing climate change happening, and after a couple decades of conjecture and forecasts and everything, it's happening now before our very eyes, and it's rapidly accelerating, right? Because we all know that the exponential impact that our consumption and waste and energy is creating. And so we have this growing cannabis industry, and I'm very concerned about the environmental impacts of the cannabis industry, and that that we need to honor the cannabis consciousness, the the historic progressive and counterculture consciousness that kept everything alive and tilled the soil for legalization to happen, by addressing these issues and like, for example, water, which is becoming more of a scarcity with warming temperatures, energy, which is a big issue, of course. I think that all cannabis should be grown outdoors under the sun, the way that nature intended it personally. But then my pet peeve, which is single-use plastics. I could get in my car right now. I could drive about 4 blocks and there's a cannabis store that you go in, and it's basically like a 7-Eleven, which is a convenience store we have in America. And you've got, walls and walls of packages of cannabis of all kinds. You've got glass counters with all kinds of cannabis, be it flower and rolled joints and oils and tinctures and dabs and all that stuff. And almost every single thing is in plastic, single-use plastic, especially doob tubes and plastic envelopes that have buds in them. And we need to do better than that. I think it's outrageous. I go on these long 28-block power walks, and I have for years in my neighborhood. And I used to boast saying, I see beer cans on the ground and I see, cigarette butts everywhere, but I don't see roaches, right? Well, I don't have that boast anymore, because what I see now more than anything on my walks is empty doob tubes and empty pot packages, especially at bus stops and places like that. And we need, and it's not like there aren't alternatives available. Glass or cardboard doob tubes already exist. And also, we need to look at the emerging technology with biodegradable hemp plastic. And I think that's the technology that we really should be exploiting. If I have my way, we're going to stop seeing all this single-use plastics, because we know that those plastics break down into microplastics in the environment. And in my city, they go down the drain and then they go straight down into the Puget Sound and into the ocean. And they just absolutely wreak havoc on the environment. They say that by 2050, that there's going to be more weight, pound for pound, there's going to be more plastic than there'll be marine wildlife in the ocean. And every human being in America, at least, I forget what it was, but consumes a certain amount of plastics every week.
It was a global study. I think it was a Japanese and Canadian study where they compiled loads of metadata, and it's a credit card size of plastic a week.
Yes, that's right. A credit card per week of plastic that we're eating, right?
Yeah. And
so we need to be leaders in the global community. Mm-hmm. But the problem is there's money to be made, and the cheapest available packaging right now is the plastic packaging. So that's the one they're going to choose until consumers, basically refuse to buy that stuff and demand something else. I think it's going to continue, and it's very unfortunate. But that's one of the areas that I'm trying to raise awareness in.
Mm. There was actually I can't remember the name of the company now, but there was a company at the very back end towards I can't remember what it was now, the Dr. Seuss themed stage at Hempfest in 2018 at the back. I think it was by Dope Stage, yeah.
Skunk Magazine.
Yeah, the back towards there was a company that were doing plant plastics. And so they had sort of, they had examples of their own, but they also had Sana out of California that do the cannabis plastic ones.
Yes, Sana packaging. Yes, I've had those folks on my show. Yeah, they're doing good stuff. The technology's got a little ways to go. But I think that biodegradable plastics is really, a fascinating potential alternative to all this petrochemical plastics. And there's bamboo is another very versatile plant also, which is, grows anywhere like a weed, like cannabis, requires very little maintenance.
Mycelium as well. Paul Stamets up your neck of the woods, literally in Washington State, the national forests, and that the technology and the patents that his team and that are creating is phenomenal. I was at a UK expo, shout out to Paradise Gardens recently, hosting a podcast there. And I met a guy who is working with research, and they're using cannabis graphene. So that's cannabis paper with cannabis graphene ink. And so obviously you press them together to make like supercapacitor batteries. And what they'd done is connected a cannabis battery to a mycelium circuit. So they'd grown a circuit from mycelium. So it's the things that they're moving forward with, the potential research that once we can get past the stigma and the false moralizing of, oh, it's a drug and must protect the children. The applications of it, as Jack Harris said, there's thousands, tens of thousands of uses for this thing. I mean, that's a hemp straw, or a cannabis straw. And it's, again, the reason that the plant-based polymer plastics are so wonderful is they don't have those BPAs and BPZs. And it's those that are endocrine disruptors. They're causing and wreaking havoc, as you say. So if we can switch towards that, we're obviously going to have a problem with what we've already got existing, and we're going to have to come up with quite innovative ways of solving this. But they have found fungus. They have even found, was it a worm that eats plastic? Paul Stamets, I know they were working on creating several different strains of mushrooms that can then clean up petrochemical spills, that can clean up certain toxic sites. We know obviously with cannabis's bioremedial properties that you can actually clean up irradiated sites. We can take heavy metals and other toxins out of soils. And I think we need to convince the system to understand that truly vertically integrating all of that. If you're going to grow cannabis and sell it to people that want to just enjoy a fat joint, kick back and watch, I don't know, the Super Bowl or whatever, you can use all of that plant the whole way. You can extract oils to then make cannabis-based medications. You can then extract the flower to sell, but then using the sticks and stems, you've got the polymers. You can make papers from it. You can make fibers from it. You can make biofuels from it. We could, if we then hybridize, as it were, hemp and cannabis, if you know what I mean, remove the arbitrary distinction between them and really get into the research of this, we could be growing those trees, producing kilo after kilo after kilo. I mean, I've seen some of the things they grow in Cali, but if they were allowed to use all of that fibrous material as well to make that packaging, to power that facility, to build the new dry house, it's literally, sorry, go on.
And of course, they're required to destroy it right now, which is absurd.
That's what broke my heart. I was on a farm, shout out to Fog Farms in Mendocino, and we stood in their dry room, and it's like a 2-story thing, and he just walked out, and I went, what's that over there? And pointing to this giant mound. And he went, that's our sticks and stems. And I went, have you ever heard of graphene? And he went, no. And I explained a couple of things about the industrial thing, and he went, we're legally not allowed to touch that. I can either be a hemp farmer and grow for this, or I can be an industrial and grow for this, or I can be a recreational and I'm only allowed this. I said, that is unbelievable.
And we've also discovered there's tremendous therapeutic benefits in the root ball as well, in cannabis roots, which also have to be destroyed. And Simpa, the bioremedial properties of cannabis, which means that it leaches out heavy metals and radiation and stuff out of the soil. It just sucks it right out like a vacuum. That is another reason that we need to have testing of the recreational cannabis, because heavy metals are actually a part of the grow mediums, right? Because the plant, thrives off of that stuff. But we need testing of our recreational cannabis for mold and fungus and heavy metals and pesticides, right? Which is another thing that my state is behind on as well. And we've had Uncle Ike's is a chain here in Seattle, the largest actual recreational chain, and they have proactively started testing all of their products for these adulterants, right? Which is a very important thing, especially for medical marijuana patients who might have multiple sclerosis or some immunodeficiency diseases and stuff, who really can't afford to have any extra toxins put in their bodies. But nobody can afford that, right? And everybody should be smoking or vaping or eating clean cannabis. And so that's another issue that wasn't, really something we were aware of in the black market days. But as things are becoming more commercially, a lot of the black market weed initially was all grown outdoors, but then it was starting to be grown indoors by small operations mostly. But now we have these big industrial operations going on. And it's really imperative that we have proper testing and oversight. And there's also with the labs that we do have, there's no oversight on them either. And I've heard that, if you get a negative test result for your THC or your CBD content then you go to a different lab, right? And everybody knows that there's a lab that you can find that'll give you the testing that you want, right? Mm-hmm. So we need regulation and oversight of the labs as well. So it's a very complex, this legalization creates all kinds of layers of new issues that we have to face. And here at Seattle Hempfest, one of the directions that we're trying to lean into is public, what's the word? I'm having a brain fog here.
Awareness?
It's public interest, I guess, is the word I'm looking for consumer and consumer rights and consumer protections, right? Mm-hmm. Essentially.
Yeah, I mean, for me,
Ralph Nader, he started his big thing in public interest. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, yeah, you look at most of the, so say in the UK, we have the British standard, which goes on in most things. So obviously there are global standards and conventions around production of a lot of things within a capitalist market. There has to be a certain amount of standardization for protection, that it be ubiquitous understanding across cultures and across languages for how a product should work and should act. And this just isn't true of cannabis. This is one of the things that really surprised me when I was driving around. So I landed in Colorado, ended up going through Oregon, up to Washington, back down, then through to California. And the difference that I saw, Oregon was probably my preferred, because although they had censorship on like names that appealed to kids. I mean, I walked in and went, "What's C Kush?" And the guy went, it's candy. And I went, all right. I was like, "Why is it not on the label?" And he explained the nuance. And then when I bought my first package, and on the side of it, it had the nutrients. It had the grow medium. And I was like, oh, okay, I can make a real informed decision here. Because in the other states that I went to, it was no. And I can almost tell by the nature of the packaging, how large of a brand, how much they'd put into that made me feel they'd put less into the actual product. So it was difficult in some states where I couldn't then sort of see and play with the product, as it were, compared to others where in Colorado, I went into one of the shops one morning, there was no one around for half an hour, and the woman just kept giving me giant bags of weed to take selfies with. So it was quite a different experience, where in California, I had to surrender my passport, go in through like an airlock system, sign up so they could take my data, then buy the stuff, then get my passport back. So when I was staying in, where was that? Is it Eureka? Is it up in the north? Sort of desert on one side, mountains on the other. And I did a 3-hour round trip back to Oregon to go and buy weed, because I was like, I'm not going anywhere in Cali again with that. So I was literally, drove all the way back up to Oregon. And then I didn't realize that there's a border on California for fruits and vegetables and stuff. And so I drove through that, like, anything to declare? And I'm like, no, just slowly creeping through. Yeah, mental experience.
Yeah, well, that's going to change when federal legalization happens, right? Then there'll be federal standards that every state will have to observe, right? And so that's one of the downsides of this kind of patchwork of state, state legal situations. Oregon, by far, I think, has done a lot of things right. Oregon, by the way, just legalized psilocybin and entheogens, and so did Seattle. Actually, Seattle just legalized possession and production of entheogens as well in the city limits. Yeah. So there's good things happening, but what we're experiencing in my state is this apathy towards any further reforms. There's this attitude that, well, I can go down to a store and I can buy an ounce of weed and I can drive off and I don't need to look in my rearview mirror because there's no cop behind me. He's not going to care. It's legal. And I hear that actually from people go, "Oh, you're still doing Seattle Hempfest? Why? Isn't it legal?" And that really makes me angry. I'm like, no, it's federally illegal, number one. Number two, you can still get a felony if you've got 29 grams in Washington State, and you can't grow it at home unless you're a medical marijuana patient, and you've gone through the hoops. And even if you are a patient in my state, you can only grow the 3 plants unless you're into the state registry. And I would never put my name in the state registry because we all know that your data is not safe in this world these days. And the federal government can get a hold of that. We don't know who the next president's going to be. And And the other thing is about this concept that it's legal. I'm like, well, why don't you walk 2 steps across the Idaho border, the border into Idaho, light up a joint and tell me how legal cannabis is. People right now, as we're having this podcast, somebody has the light behind their car. Somebody's got their door being bashed in and their life's going to change. There's somebody having their custody of their children taken from them. Cannabis use is a big issue in divorces, in divorce court in certain states and stuff. It's not legal at all. It's tolerated, like it was in Amsterdam, or in Holland for decades. But we still have a lot of work to do. But there's this attitude of, well, I can go get my pot, so what's the problem? And that's something that we're really fighting against right now. There's an apathy. There's a lot, and that extends to the legislature. And you kind of mentioned this at the beginning of your show. We have a state senator who, when we approached her to do some lobbying, she says, well, I have marijuana fatigue. I don't want any more marijuana bills. And said, you got marijuana fatigue. We got prohibition fatigue, and it's been going a lot longer than your marijuana fatigue, right? And I'll tell you what, you want to make us go away? You want to not hear any more from us? Then pass some sensible goddamn laws, right? And we'll go away forever.
Yeah.
But we can't get anything passed. We worked so hard to get some cultivation laws passed, and we just couldn't even get any traction. And that's with a Democratic legislature here, which traditionally would have been more positive.
Is it an issue of vested interest? Because here in the UK, for example, we have several members of our current sitting government are directly invested in what they call it medical cannabis. I'll call it prescribed cannabis, while then still voting down and still saying that cannabis is a dangerous and addictive substance, that if you buy it on the street, you should be punished for it. It's a mental kind of position. So do you think that, part of that is this idea that it's detrimental to big business? Why would you empower the little guy when it's such a useful tool? You've got the best of both worlds. You've got the kosh. So then if you've got, how much did you have? 28.2? That's enough. That's over, right? Where was he with this? Okay. So then it's still being able to be used as a means to harm somebody that is deemed unpleasant to the system or to the establishment in some way. And I think that's what until we are truly free of it being shoehorned into a way of harming us, then it's not legal. The war isn't over.
Yeah, I think you're basically on the right track. We have a couple of factors going on here. One is, of course, we have heard that, that if people grow cannabis at home, it'll make its way into the black market, right, and compete with recreational cannabis, which they're getting tax revenue out of, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just not the case. We have a gigantic alcohol industry in America and in Washington State, but you can brew up to 20,000 gallons of spirits, right? Well, nobody's selling those spirits on the black market, right? But nothing's hurting the alcohol industry at all, even though you can home brew at home, microbrew, brew your own wine and stuff like that. So that's a red herring. But what we also have is we've got trade groups. We have these trade industry groups that have lobbyists that are lobbying the legislature full time. And these, yes, they're recreational. It's funny, about half the recreational store owners are for cultivation. They realize number one, that it's not legal if you can't grow your own. And number two, they're not threatened by it. They realize that the average person, anybody could get a cow and put a cow, in their yard and milk their cow. But how many people are going to do that to get their milk? They're not. They're going to go down to the store and they're going to buy a half gallon of milk, right? Because it's cheaper, it's easier, and let's face it. And growing cannabis actually is complicated, and it requires an investment. It requires time and energy, and you got to be really good at it, or you're not going to get the kind of yield. It requires almost full-time attention. So the average person is still going to go to a store and buy their weed. When they go to grab cigarettes or whatever, they're going to stop at the pot store and grab an eighth or whatever. But if you're a medical marijuana patient and you don't feel that you can trust what's on the back of that package because there's no guarantees, there's no way to validate what it says, number one. Number two, the stores don't necessarily stock the strains that medical marijuana patients are looking looking for, right? They're all geared towards the recreational market. They're all geared, high THC is what it's all about, high THC. And everybody's looking, what's the amount of THC? And we're finding that that actually is not the biggest indicator of good weed. There's a lot of other, there's terpenes and all kinds of other things that add to the robust, euphoric effect or what have you. So patients are going to want to make sure that their weed is organic, and they're going to want to make sure that that they got the strains that they want, be it Charlotte's Web or what have you, because they have MS or whatever best strain that they're looking for. And that can only be done if you're growing your own, right? So there's a lot of factors at play, but certainly, once again, everything always kind of comes down to the money. And right now, the legislature is doing what legislatures do, and that is they kowtow to the corporate interests, to the big boys. And we've seen tremendous carpetbagging in the states where cannabis is legal. You've got, big corporate entities which contributed absolutely nothing to legalization whatsoever. In fact, a lot of them supported prohibition until the change. And then now, of course, they're rushing in to dominate the recreational cannabis market because they got the resources to do so, and they wait till somebody has created a popular and a respected brand, right? And done all of the R&D and taken all the risks and figured it out. And then they just come in and buy it up and consolidate their wealth and their market share. Which is, it's the American way. It's business, it's the global way with business. So nothing's changed. I was naive enough. I was naive enough for decades to think that legalization would mean that we would all keep doing the things that we were doing. We just wouldn't have a risk of going to jail. And the reality is that before legalization, I was growing weed. I had a basement full of beautiful plants, right? And I'll be honest right now that one of the ways I was able to be a full-time activist for over 20 years leading up to legalization was I sold weed to my friends. I could stay home and I could be working on all of this stuff. And if I had to go somewhere to a hearing or to an event or a symposium or something like that in another state, I could just pick up and leave because I didn't have a job, right? I grew weed and I sold weed to my friends. All my friends smoked weed. And so it was a perfect situation. And now I couldn't sell a gram of weed if my life depended on it. And I wouldn't grow weed because I couldn't afford the electricity because there's no market. The black market is, almost non-existent compared to the way it was. It still exists out there, but I don't have access to it, it's worth the trade-off's worth it to me because that means that people aren't going to jail for cannabis, and that people aren't losing custody of their kids in Washington State. The smell of cannabis is no longer probable cause to detain you or to search your car in Washington State, which is huge, right?
Yeah.
Because before you'd be petrified, if you smoke a joint in your car and you get pulled over, boy, it's over. If they could smell the weed or whatever, it's a joint in your ashtray, then they'd have probable cause to search your car and your body. So really the trade-off is worth it, but it was a lot different from what a lot of us anticipated. That's for sure. And unfortunately, it was also a displacement of income that took place. There were a lot of people prior to legalization that were living on the margins. Either they're on Social Security or they're disabled, or whatever their situation is. They were barely getting by, and they were able to supplement their income by selling a little weed or growing a little weed. Well, those people now are homeless. I know people that, did great for 25 years and are homeless now because they lost that extra income that was making the difference between them being on welfare or being on the street or not. So that's another unintended impact of reforming the laws, So it turned out to be a lot more complex than we anticipated in the old days when we were just thought that we would just legalize pot and then nothing would change except we're not going to jail anymore.
Yeah. Like you said, there is so much impact and so much still, I guess, to unpack over time for us to understand this. As I said before, it's only going to be 10 years since Colorado and Washington went through with this in next year in 2022, sorry. And so, yeah, a lot of the data that has been accrued has showed that teenage use hasn't exploded. There is obviously increase in things like vape consumption, and then a black market of counterfeit vapes is kicking up. But that's not just the US problem. That is massively an issue in Europe as well. And it is kind of what you were saying before. It's the people doing the R&D and the legwork in illegal territories and regions around the world that have seen what's happened to people like Burner and Cookies and people that have started the brands that worked illegally, that had, I don't know if you want to describe this, with the fortitude and bravery to stand up to prohibition and go, you know what, it's against the law, but I'm going to grow my plants. I'm going to live and take part in my community, celebrate my culture. And that's one of the things that, yeah, I've heard from quite a few of the different people I've spoken to in regions that went legal, guys that grew illegally, people that transported over state lines and stuff, guys that risked serious time. And most of them were lucky, the ones that I spoke to, they were lucky, obviously, to transition then into a legal market. They were in the right place at the right time. They had capital behind them. They didn't have a conviction because they hadn't been caught. They had the network and the skill set at the time. But as you said, the hobbyist, the individual who is then looking at this going, I'll vote for this because then I can get a job in here. That until there is something concrete, something that is intrinsically built into the law that then allows almost like a positive discrimination or a discretion towards individuals who they have prior experience in it, so they should get priority. Because frankly, if others are in a
got, for example, Humboldt, California, in Northern California, you had a community that since the 1960s was, traditionally hippies and Vietnam vets and stuff that wanted to kind of be back to the land and have homesteads and produce their own food and stuff. And they started growing cannabis because they initially started growing cannabis for their own use, right? But then they realized, wow, there's this underground market. And if I grow an extra couple pounds of cannabis, I can sell that and I can buy salt or sugar or coffee or whatever it is I need. And eventually I can get a tractor that I need or whatever. And they started doing this and became this giant underground economy. And then medical marijuana happened and the price of cannabis soared. And all of a sudden in these towns, the guys that were against legalization selling refrigerators or selling trucks are like, all of a sudden they're selling refrigerators, they're selling trucks, they're selling tractors. And they're like, wow. And there's this huge economy. And so you had these communities in Northern California, Oregon, Central Oregon and stuff, which were kind of thrived under cannabis cultivation. Beautiful communities that had, community councils, and they were extremely aware and progressive and forward thinking and stuff. And then legalization happened, and these people all fought for legalization, thinking that then they would be able to be legitimate. They could legitimately grow cannabis and legitimately sell cannabis on the open market. And what happened was that the regulations and the fees and everything were so high and so expensive that unless you were a huge corporate, farmer that had giant operation, and then you could come in with a lot of capital, they couldn't compete and they got edged out. And now those historic communities that were there for 30, 40 years are gone, basically. And that's another, culturally, that's kind of been cultural genocide in that sense. And it's funny, I never thought about it before it happened, but the worst thing that happened to my cannabis culture that I loved and thought I was defending all these years, it got wiped out by legalization. There's kind of a new neo-cannabis culture that exists, which is more, with influencers and fashion and stuff like that. That is, not bad, it's positive. But the traditional culture, the OG granddaddies and grandmothers of the whole cannabis paradigm aren't included in the new world, and that's sad and unfortunate. And that's kind of a lesson, I guess, that we learn that we've seen in the past. We've seen that in other historical industries where, like, when electricity came in, it displaced a bunch of people. It's not a new phenomenon. Still something that we were kind of unprepared for.
But at least with the creation of electricity in most regions around the world, you will find museums to the creation of it that honors the heritage and the history of, say, in the UK, we had guys on giant penny farthings that would then go around and light the street lamps. And so most kids will know about that. They'll be taught about that. So I feel that we're in a point of history where, thanks to people like yourself, I stepped into this at such a fortuitous time. I haven't risked half of what others have risked because of the privilege of my skin color, the region that I'm in, the way that I can speak, the things that I know, and the connections and networks that I have built, you know? But I feel that my point now isn't to push it over the line. It's going across the line anyway. I'm in the position that you were at, except maybe a bit more informed or fearful of what it could be. So I'm going to vote against whatever this government pushes forward. If it's a referendum and we have an opportunity, I don't think it will be progressive enough. And I think that ours will stagnate. Our system between the House of Commons and the House of Lords means that once we pass a law, if they then push enough of their peers from MPs into lordship, which is hereditary and a lifetime, they can vote down anything from the parliament for the rest of time. So then we wouldn't be able to get another opportunity. I think we're going to have one chance to get the right thing pushed in this country. And it's a weird sense that we're learning lessons from the places that have already gone in the world, but at the same time not, because this new culture, cannabis culture that is emerging, they're ignorant not because they don't want to know or they don't know, but because they've had that history and knowledge stolen from them. Most of the activists are now, unfortunately, of a generation are dying or have retired, have been locked up, they've done enough. They've fought their fight. They've given their lives for this. But I think that my generation of activists now, our responsibility is to keep alive those traditions, is to celebrate those cultures, is to introduce a new generation to what cannabis is. They've grown up in a world where they can get vape carts, they can get shatter and crumble and waxes and all manner of things. You know, I mean, even I grew up in a point of still with crushed metal pop cans, getting hard, what we used to call tack or rocky hash onto a Coke can. And so, and then like smoking, if you guys have lungs in America, where you like cut off a bottle and you have a plastic bag and you create like an air vacuum, it creates like an air, we call it a lung. And so that was my first introduction to cannabis. And now trying to explain that to some of the younger guys that are getting into this, they don't understand it, or hot knifing hash.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, cannabis is only legal for 10 years here, but it's the same thing where young people, a lot of young people, all they've ever known is these weed stores, you know, and you can just go into a store and buy some weed, right? And they don't understand in the same way that when a person of color gets on the front of a bus in America, they're not thinking about Rosa Parks, but Rosa Parks is the reason they can get on the front of that bus. You know what I mean? And so it is interesting how quickly we habituate to the status quo and to the current paradigm. You know, at Seattle Hempfest, and you know, speaking of Hempfest, we've been, you know, savaged, brutalized by the pandemic. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened in the last 2 years, and I'm not sure that we're going to survive from it. But we have a lawsuit right now, a constitutional challenge, because our state legislature came in and made cannabis advertising illegal at events like Hempfest, which cost us about $200,000 in sponsorships the first year that happened. And so we have a legal challenge in appeals court right now, federal appeals court, challenging the constitutionality of those advertising restrictions, right? Because you can advertise alcohol at an event like Hempfest, you just can't advertise, you know, cannabis. And it's similar to the situation in Oregon where, you know, you can't have something named candy. It can't be cherry this or strawberry that, or anything even like that, because they think that's going to appeal to children. You can't have a cartoonish, you know, figure or anything like that. And so, and I actually am surprised nobody's challenged the constitutionality of that, actually. But that doesn't concern me quite as much as, you know, the inability to have advertisements and stuff. We should be able to compete with, certainly with alcohol, which kills 40,000 people directly per year in America. And, you know, who knows how many indirectly with car accidents and suicides and you know, domestic violence and what have you, you know, cirrhosis of the liver and all that kind of stuff like that.
Yeah, but again, it's comorbidity in various cancers as well. I think actually the World Health Organization statistics say that 5% 1 in 20 global deaths is caused and attributable to alcohol consumption, which is
alcohol.
insane when you think about it. And so, yeah, I think advertising is what gives the little guy a bit more of an opportunity to compete, you know, to be able to use like viral sort of ad jamming old style sort of campaigns, to be able to get attention and to use the current mediums and platforms like social media to be able to build a community, to be able to rally people behind a cause, kind of like the is it the Prohibition brand? I can't remember what they're called. The guys who they grow weed in a prison in California. The evidence bags sort of brand that then put their money in it, like Last Prisoner Project. And
you know, that's funny that you mentioned that, because I've got those folks on my show on Monday.
Oh, nice.
I've got the evidence coming on.
Yeah, and so even the way they're advertising everything makes you think about it. Every time you buy that product, you're like evidence bag, and it harks back. It's a homage and an honoring of the struggle of the people that are still in prison, the countless number of people. There's a kid in Dubai at the minute, a British lad who's a football coach, who was caught with some cannabis oil bottles that I think it's the information's a bit difficult. Some are reporting it was a synthetic cannabinoid, some are reporting it's CBD, but he's now doing 25 years in Dubai for this. And then you've got a guy for what?
Yes.
2 pounds. You guys would say a kilo, 2 pounds, about there, the same 2.2 pounds, I think is a kilo. So this guy was caught with possession of about a kilo, 2 pounds. And they want to hang him in, is it Singapore?
Yeah,
so you still think, you still look at what's actually going down. And yet the apathy, as you said, within most of these markets is because people are well off, but the people that are making the money are doing well with it. And all they care about is what the customers want. And the level of education throughout the average consumer is, I want the highest number THC because I want to get fucked up. I want to prove to my mates that I can do more than them. So I'm going to buy. And it's all about excess consumption and this binge culture and this almost bravado and ego identification with the plant. And it misses the idea that we're supposed to build a personal relationship with this plant. Our endocannabinoid systems are so different and so unique, in the same way as our fingerprints are, and the profiles of the plants, of the cultivars, affect us differently. So me and you sat in the same room consuming literally the same bud off the same plant will have two very different, or potentially two very different effects. And until we recognize that truth, until we honor the variety, the diversity, and accept there's a hell of a lot we don't know, all we're going to do is create millions of consumers that are going to happily go and rip through 3 layers of single-use packaging and throw it on the floor to consume their joint that's just going to screw them up at 35% THC and not think about the terpenes in it. And is that going to make me anxious? Is it going to make me depressed or not sleep very well? I mean, it's so nuanced, the effects of this. And yet the boys at the top that are set to make billions from it are still advertising it as cannabinoid this versus cannabinoid that, because they then can create proliferal markets and they own it. Look at what's happening with Delta 8 and Delta 10 because of all the hemp farmers suddenly allowed to grow and produce CBD isolate by the ton.
Yeah. And now that we have this CBD fad kind of going on, with the lack of regulation and oversight, we've got this inferior product coming in from China and other places, right? And you don't know what's in that stuff. It's not being adequately vetted, adequately tested and stuff. There's a lot to it. That's one of the reasons why I'm so proud to be working with Skunk Magazine, because the values and the ethos of Julie Chiarello, the executive editor, owner, and Skunk really align with mine. Skunk's the only cannabis magazine in America that's solely dedicated to organic regenerative cultivation. And I think we're the only one that has hemp paper at the moment and stuff. So I'm really proud that I was able to hook up with those folks, because they recognize that there's a new guard, that there's a new young culture happening, cannabis culture, but they also are dedicated to paying homage to the historical legacy culture that laid the groundwork and sacrificed and kept the culture alive, and pushed the envelope so that all this could be happening today. And it's And it's an exciting time. The reality is we've got a lot of work to do, and humanity has a lot of work to do on every front, really, and we always have, and we probably always will. But these are good problems to have, Simpa. In light of the history of prohibition, these are good problems to have. We're dealing with the right problems, fortunately, because that means that we're making progress, and there is a global awareness happening. And I think that, hopefully within my lifetime, we're going to see cannabis legal almost everywhere across the world. I think that prohibition is a stack of dominoes that are falling. Let's hope.
Yeah,
let's hope people like that poor guy facing execution. Let's hope that is, he's going to be one of the last, I hope, to deal with that.
I think it is at this point, unfortunately, more than likely that he will not get a stay of execution at this point. And I think that, unfortunately, there will be too many more that are going to face that situation.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that, it is a domino effect. And I think that with Canada going, with Mexico, I mean, they're dragging their heels deliberately because they're trying to figure out domestic licensing and to not allow foreign intervention into domestic markets. And I think that's what's holding back a lot of other countries is how to actually have
and we've got these treaties. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. We've got these treaties as well, these UN treaties and charters and stuff, which are a big problem, which are influencing, countries to kind of maintain the status quo. And that has to change. And that's going to take real leadership.
It's interesting because so the 1961 Convention on Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which basically kickstarted all of this and led to the Misuse of Drugs Acts around the world. There is a clause in that, which is what Canada and Uruguay used to withdraw. Oh, you're still there. Sorry, I thought you froze for a second. To withdraw from the treaty, then they changed their laws domestically and then re-signed to the treaty. So I think until then, somebody calls them out and goes, how can you do that? How can you then sign back into this treaty and be like, yeah, cannabis is bad and all you guys should keep it illegal while you have a domestic marketplace, because it's now Canada's influence is being felt around the world. Companies like Tilray and Aurora and Canopy and that are the big boys. They're buying up everything. They're taking everything. They're moving into all spaces. They're affecting politics. They're affecting lobbying because they're trying to create these global cartels. And until there is this sort of unified push by people collectively to go, whoa, this is wrong. If it's wrong in Washington that you can't grow, it's wrong in the UK. If it's wrong in India, it's wrong everywhere. That we are being denied this plant because the truth of cannabis is true no matter what language you transcribe it into. Cannabis is the plant of 1,000 names. If you look at it, it's ganja and bang in Sanskrit. It's ganja in sort of Rastafarian culture. You've then got cannabis. You've got hemp. Literally 15 to 20 different variations from different European cultures. You've got canopy. You've got all of these other different roots of it because it's always been part of our culture. Prohibition is the blip in this, and we need to recognize the hypocrisy that the people who built prohibition are now the ones who are dismantling it brick by brick. Oh, no, wait. Then we'll take this away because they've built a new wall behind it. And most people can't
because they want to figure out a way that they can continue to profit off of it, right? If they can, they're like, well, we don't mind getting rid of prohibition as long as we're still, in control, as long as we're still making the money, and as far as the universal language of cannabis, in 1995 was my first Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam, the old Cannabis Cup. It doesn't exist anymore. The High Times Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam. And I was, in a room my first day there, and I'm sitting in a room and there's about 6 or 7 of us and joints are going around and we're all getting high. And it took about 15 minutes before we realized that nobody spoke the same language, that all of us spoke a different language, but we spoke the language of cannabis, of weed, right? And so it was really funny because we were getting along fine for a while without words, right? Because we all knew what was up, Yeah. And the cool thing is I learned that cannabis enthusiasts are pretty much the same everywhere culturally in a large fashion, right? And not literally. The other thing I've noticed that over the years, I think more often than not, people that use weed are decent. you know, that weed has an effect on you. Not everybody, of course, there's gangsters and murderers that like to get high too and people like that. But overall, I think that it has a calming effect, that it tends to open your mind and shut your mouth a little bit.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, sort of some people say that they get sort of paranoid with cannabis, and I think it's more that it adds an extra filter for a lot of people, and that kind of scares them, that they go to say something with the usual confidence and cockiness they would, and a little voice in their brain goes, "Oh, should you say that? What about this? If that leads to this?" And there's that kind of like that Jiminy Cricket appears, and I think the same is true with sort of psychedelic experience. Some people kind of again get stuck with that facing of themselves, whereas sorry, I think we crossed over for a second. Yeah, and to touch on your point of the people being sort of the same the world over, I've been lucky enough to travel to sort of Morocco. I've been to sort of Spain, to Ireland, to America, to Canada, to Holland, and seen the cannabis culture in all these places. And it's sitting in somebody's living room. You know, there's drinks, there's a bit of food, there's some music or something. There's then somebody throws their stuff on the table. You know, all the skins come in, roach comes in, grinders, everything appears, and everyone just kind of goes, huh? And you smoke and you laugh and you gesture and you communicate non-verbally. Yeah, and you feel this sense of whole body connection and camaraderie, of comfort, of just. And it was wonderful. We were getting going around. We went to Chef Shawan in Morocco. And we got a very good amount of quality hash from the Rift Mountains. And so we used that as currency. So we'd go into places and kind of go hash and asking the restaurant owners, be like, yeah, you can smoke here, you can smoke here. And we tipped them with the hash. And basically the only thing you'd sort of say was like, oh, it was Moroccan chocolate. And yet you kind of make this connection with them. And then they'd remember you, and they could come out into the street, and they'd have this appreciation for a connection of cannabis, you know?
Yeah, no, I that's exactly my heart song, man. Absolutely. And you know, it would be a better world. It would be a better world if everybody had access to quality cannabis. I think that it has it you know, Bob Marley said it's the healing of the nations, you know, and I think that there's some truth to that. It's not the panacea, but you know, I don't think there's any society that a little cannabis can't help. You know, I think it's a mild hallucinogen, a mild psychedelic, and it has a grounding effect on most people, and a quasi spiritual ethos to it.
Yeah, I think the more the research and the science looks into this, the more we understand about it causing neuroplasticity and neurogenesis and stimulating creativity and novel and new thoughts and ideas and concepts. And I think the more comfortable we can get with our own sense of curiosity, our own sense of interest and intrigue with life, the easier it is for us to have open discourse and conversations about this. And that is what I truly believe cannabis and other entheogenic substances, because I would also consider it, again, a psychedelic or entheogenic substance, because of its collective and individual healing properties. And I don't just mean that in terms of common illness or chronic pain, etc. I mean in the sense of the spiritual reconnection. For me, there are times when, even now as a cannabis consumer of 15 plus years, that I'll light up a joint somewhere in a situation, or I've gone on a hike somewhere or something, I'll light a joint and I'll have this almost like I'll manifest the inner child. There will be this kind of, I'm proud of myself. You know, for a long time when I worked in retail or whatever, there was this thing in me screaming, like, what the hell are you doing? Why are you working a 12-hour shift? Why are you giving your life away? What are you going to, you know what I mean? This juxtaposition of self. Whereas then I find that connecting that solidifying of myself when I sit and I have the ritual of I'll craft a joint together. I'll take the time to deliberately consume it. The whole action of it it's ritualistic. It is pseudo-religious. You know what I mean? Around it, I've built a practice. I've built a belief system. It strengthens my ethics and helps me be curious of my own philosophies and challenge myself to actually go, oh, why do I think that? You know what I mean? To actually see myself through my own kind of eyes and have that opportunity to have that conversation. And I think that few substances, other than obviously a lot of the other classic entheogenic substances, give us that chance to sit with ourselves peacefully.
Yeah. In fact, some do the opposite. Some of the most popular drugs do the opposite, like, opioids and alcohol. I've been 45 years or more in the cannabis culture myself. And when I was younger, I'd be working some job, some kitchen job or whatever, restaurant job, because I usually had long hair and stuff because I was a hippie musician type guy. And I'd be at work and something would happen and somebody would piss me off, and I would just be mad. I'd be slamming things, and I'd have this attitude, and I'd get off work, and I'd come home and I'd pack a bowl or fire up a joint, take a couple tokes, and I'd be like, what the hell? What the fuck was I doing? What an asshole. And I would suddenly realize, why was I letting this trivial thing get under my skin? It's meaningless. And it would just completely vaporize all of that anxiety, that animosity, that anger would literally just transform. It was like somebody lifted a veil and I could crystal clear see through the emotional bullshit that I was, that I was allowing to dominate my consciousness. And that's what I think cannabis does for a lot. It doesn't do it for everybody, but I think for most people, that's what cannabis does. And one thing I don't know about anybody else, but the cannabis that I get now in rec stores, some of it gives me anxiety. And I never experienced that before, right? It makes me anxious and stuff. And I've heard a variety of different theories that some of it's the crossbreeding that's been going on and stuff, or adulterants and hardeners and things that are used. And I don't know really what the nature, what's really behind that. But overall, cannabis, relaxes people, brings us down to earth, makes us more grounded, more centered. And I think that's, a big positive.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's an issue that we're seeing here sort of in the UK. We have big sort of gangs and organized criminal entities that are cultivating on such mass and using such poor techniques. They're using literally people trafficked in that are then exploited and put up into grow houses, into warehouses, and basically locked in for 3 months to pull a crop cycle. And yeah, the PGRs, the plant growth regulators or retardants that are being used within cultivation just for appearance sake. So it's Instagram worthy. So it's that hard, glistening. Again, the bioremediation and accumulative properties of cannabis, it literally builds from what you feed it. That is kind of how the nature of the plant works. So yeah, you can flush them whatever else.
And now that it's about volume, right? It's not about quality as much as it's about volume. In the black market days, it was about quality. And if you had the best weed, then you were going to make money, the most money. But now, because there's such aggressive competition, it's about volume. It's about who can, bust out the most. And let's face it, when there's millions of dollars involved, people cut corners. Not everybody has integrity. Not everybody has honesty, which is why, unfortunately, we need some kind of regulatory oversight and standardization and things like that, so that we can have consumer protections, which is a whole new reality we never thought we'd be talking about. I'm sorry, Simpa, go ahead.
No, but that leads me on to then this idea that the perfect way to honor the legacy market, and to honor the people that literally went to prison, that gave their lives, that had children removed, marriages break up, that lived with the stigma of being a cannabis consumer, of worrying if they smell a man with their kid is going to pull it in closer, people are going to cross the street, that corrosive day in, day out. I live on a police route, and so literally I have sirens 20, 30 times a day, and still, no matter how comfortable, how informed, how safe I feel, that goes, and something in me goes, ugh, I tense and I get raw, and it's that compounding effect. The best way to deal with that is to allow those people to speak in a forum that then legislators and people that are going to make policy go, how the hell do we fix that? Money isn't just going to fix that. We need to change the systems more systemically, more from the base up. It's literally, it's all well and good throwing money at disproportionately affected communities, but we also need to look at the consequences of what decades have done. So if you bring them to, I preach quite often now, the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the same as they did after apartheid in South Africa. They brought everybody from all sides, and there was a kind of discretion allowed where everyone was like, just tell your shit. Just come and be honest, and let's figure out what the hell has happened, why it's happened, and what we can do to not let it continue. And I think if the same could be done with cannabis, where not just the corporate interests, not just the vested interests of venture capitalists is...
Sorry.
That's all right.
I should have turned that off.
It's quite all right. Not just the needs of venture capitalists are served, but those people that were directly affected. I think that if you can create that body, that entity that then gets to build the policy that's then going to govern everybody, from the victims of the war that were directly affected by it, to the people that have also died and been a victim to it through rampant climate change, through rampant wealth inequality, through substandard housing, through poor energy connections, all of these things that could have been potentially dealt with utilizing cannabis as a resource.
Yes. Sorry,
That's quite all right.
Our attorney. Let him know that I was on an extremely important podcast right now.
Ooh.
I want to say how much I've enjoyed my association with you, Simpa, and this conversation. You just are, a brethren, a kindred spirit, and just so well versed and learned and articulate in all these issues. It's a pleasure to be talking to somebody across the pond who I identify with on such a heart level, man.
Likewise. And just before I let you go, because I am aware I've kept you a little bit longer. I just wanted to echo that, man. Seriously, when I spoke to you and you sent me out this copy of your book, which I will plug in the bio below, and we spoke on your radio show, it really gave me this sense that the world is a lot larger than I was thinking. I was still struggling with the idea of the UK and its draconian ideas. And when I encapsulated this idea that I'm going to do this road trip, screw it. I'll land in Colorado. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll rent a car and I'll figure this out. And so you inspired me then, you inspire me now. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, brother. So I hope to have another one again sometime soon.
You bet, man. Anytime. And the best of luck. I'm so glad that you decided to do your own podcast and stuff and get all of your truths out and stuff. Cause you're spot on, man. You're doing a great job. And I'm very pleased to see you out there doing this, man. We need more Simpas.
Oh, I'm humbled, brother. I am humbled. Thank you very much for your time, Vivian. I'll let you get off and I'll do the housekeeping and goodbyes.
All right. Stay strong, my friend.
You too. Peace and love.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime,
right,
man. Anytime. Bye.
Peace.
That was Vivian McPeak, guys, the author and producer of this wonderful book, Protestival, 20-year retrospective of the world's largest cannabis rally, Seattle Hempfest. Beautiful, beautiful book. Amazing images, cataloging 20 years of the event and the story of kind of how it came together, and just, truly inspirational, man. I find Vivian to be, as we kind of alluded to there on the podcast when we had him on. Recording with him in 2018 really ignited in me this idea that there is a much larger world out there, that we can take the best ideas, we can learn and network to a wider world to bring them back here to the UK and to other countries, and to really have this global network of ideas, of a sharing of knowledge, of a collective push towards a global ideal, which is that nobody should be criminalized, nobody should be stigmatized, demonized, or in any which way lose out in their life because they choose to consume cannabis, because they choose to develop their own individual relationship with this beautiful, unique, and humble plant. So stay strong, folks, wherever you are in the world. I see you guys out there on my listener list. You are all over the place, and I love you, from Turkey to Finland, to India, to all over America. Shout out my Texas, New York crew. How you doing, folks? We've got listeners down now in Mexico as well, former Czech Republic. So I see you guys. Big love. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for caring. If you enjoyed this, do check us out on patreon.com/Simpa Life, where you can help me keep this project going for less than a cup of coffee a week. I say that actually. Less than a cup of coffee a week in the UK. I don't know how extortionately priced our favorite dark caffeine beverage is in your region of the world. I do hope it isn't too extortionate. It's one of those things that I would like to grow my own. But even though that's legal, I couldn't be asked. So maybe Vivian's got a point about most people not wanting to grow their own weed. Who knows? Who knows? Check us out on all social media platforms at The Simpa Life. I've been Simpa Carter. You have been wonderful. I love you. And I will see you fine folks later. Peace.